Hey guys, tonight we begin with something truly dark and dangerous. The world of medieval alchemists, those mysterious figures hunched over bubbling cauldrons, desperately trying to turn lead into gold while dodging accusations of witchcraft and heresy. While movies make alchemy look mystical and romantic, the truth is being a medieval alchemist was basically signing your own death warrant. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1203, and your brother Marcus, a Benedictine monk with a very dangerous secret. By day, you copy scriptures and tend to the sick. By night, you're risking your soul and your life in a hidden laboratory beneath the monastery, trying to unlock the deepest secrets of creation itself. The good news, you might actually discover something revolutionary. The bad news, the church considers what you're doing to be somewhere between heresy and devil worship, and they're very good at dealing with both. Your laboratory is tucked away in a stone cellar that officially doesn't exist. Getting there means slipping through a hidden door behind the wine storage, crawling through a narrow passage that scrapes your shoulders, and praying that Brother Benedict doesn't decide to do a midnight inventory check. The smell hits you before you even light your candle, a complex mixture of sulfur, mercury, burning charcoal, and something that might be rotting organic matter, but you'd rather not think too hard about it. Welcome to medieval alchemy, where every experiment could be your last, and not because of chemical accidents. Let's be clear about one thing. Nobody in 1203 woke up and said, "You know what, I'd like to spend my nights mixing toxic substances while hiding from religious authorities who think I'm consorting with demons." Becoming an alchemist wasn't a career choice you made lightly. It was more like an obsession that grabbed you by the throat and refused to let go, even when common sense was screaming that you should probably take up something safer, like juggling flaming torches in front of hostile crowds. Most medieval alchemists weren't the wise, bearded sages you see in fantasy movies. They were scholars, monks, physicians, and occasionally wealthy nobles who had stumbled across ancient texts and couldn't resist the lure of forbidden knowledge. Some were genuinely brilliant natural philosophers trying to understand how the world worked. Others were desperate individuals convinced that the secret to unlimited wealth was just one more experiment away. And a few were probably just really bad at understanding when to quit. If you were a monk like Marcus, alchemy seemed like a logical extension of your studies. After all, weren't you already trying to understand God's creation? What could be more holy than attempting to master the same transformative powers that the Almighty had used to shape the world? The problem was that this reasoning sounded a lot more convincing at 2 a.m. in a candlelit laboratory than it did when you were trying to explain it to an Inquisition tribunal. For physicians, alchemy offered the promise of better medicines and cures for diseases that were currently untreatable. In an age when bloodletting was considered advanced medical treatment, the idea of creating powerful elixirs and healing compounds was incredibly appealing. Unfortunately, it also meant spending a lot of time working with substances that could kill you faster than the diseases you were trying to cure. Wealthy patrons got into alchemy for the most obvious reason: money. The promise of transmuting base metals into gold was like a medieval lottery ticket, except instead of buying it at a corner store, you had to build a secret laboratory and risk being burned at the stake. Some nobles spent fortunes funding alchemical research, convinced that they were just one breakthrough away from unlimited wealth. Spoiler alert, most of them went broke long before they found the Philosopher's Stone. But regardless of how you got into alchemy, one thing was certain: there was no going back. Once you'd seen mercury transform from liquid to powder and back again, once you'd watched ordinary salt create flames that burned in impossible colors, once you'd felt that intoxicating rush of believing you were on the verge of unlocking cosmic secrets, well, you were hooked. And in medieval Europe, being hooked on alchemy was about as safe as being hooked on challenging the Pope to arm wrestling contests. Your laboratory equipment looks like something between a medieval kitchen and a torture chamber, and honestly, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. The centerpiece is your athanor, a specially designed furnace that can maintain constant temperatures for days or even weeks. This isn't just any fire, it's a precisely controlled heating system that took you months to build and calibrate. The furnace body is made of thick clay bricks, insulated with layers of ash and sand, and designed with air vents that allow you to control the heat with remarkable precision. Getting the athanor right was crucial because alchemy wasn't just about mixing random substances together and hoping for the best. Every procedure required specific temperatures maintained for exact periods of time. Too hot, and your carefully prepared materials would burn to useless ash. Too cold, and the transformation you were trying to achieve simply wouldn't happen. Medieval alchemists were essentially running chemical experiments with equipment that had to be handcrafted from scratch, calibrated through trial and error, and operated by candlelight in hidden rooms where nobody could help if things went wrong. Around your furnace, you've arranged the rest of your apparatus with the care of a master craftsman. Your alembics, those distinctive flask and tube combinations used for distillation, are made of the finest glass you could acquire, and each one represents a significant investment. Glass was expensive in medieval times, and good laboratory glassware was even more so. A single broken alembic could set your research back months, not just because of the cost, but because finding a glassblower skilled enough to create precision laboratory equipment was nearly impossible. Your pelicans, circular vessels designed for continuous circulation of liquids, sit alongside your retorts, cucurbits, and receivers. Each piece of equipment serves a specific purpose in the complex dance of medieval chemistry. The pelican allows you to keep liquids circulating for weeks at a time, gradually concentrating and purifying them. The retorts let you decompose substances by heating them in sealed containers, capturing the vapors and condensing them back into liquids. It's sophisticated stuff, the kind of equipment that wouldn't look entirely out of place in a modern chemistry lab if you could overlook the lack of safety features and the general assumption that explosions were just part of the learning process. But your most precious possessions aren't made of glass or clay, they're made of parchment and ink. Your collection of alchemical texts represents years of careful acquisition, enormous expense, and significant personal risk. These aren't books you can order from a catalogue or borrow from a library. They're hand-copied manuscripts, often translated multiple times from Arabic to Latin, filled with deliberate obscurities and coded language that makes modern technical manuals look like children's picture books. Your copy of the Emerald Tablet, attributed to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus, contains just a few dozen lines of text, but those lines are supposedly the foundation of all alchemical knowledge. As above, so below, one of the tablet's key principles, suggests that the same forces that govern the heavens also control earthly transformations. It sounds mystical, but to you it represents a genuine attempt to understand the fundamental unity underlying all natural processes. Geber's Summa Perfectionis is your practical manual, filled with detailed instructions for preparing acids, purifying metals, and creating the various compounds needed for advanced alchemical work. Geber was the Latinized name of Jabir ibn Hayyan, an 8th century Islamic scholar whose work formed the backbone of medieval European alchemy. His texts are dense, technical, and occasionally contradictory, but they contain genuine chemical knowledge that you've learned to extract through careful study and endless experimentation. The Rosary of the Philosophers contains allegorical descriptions of alchemical processes, written in symbolic language that requires constant interpretation. When it talks about the marriage of the king and queen, it's actually describing the combination of sulfur and mercury. The death and resurrection of the metals refers to the dissolution and reconstitution of metallic compounds. Learning to read these texts is like learning a secret language, one that was deliberately designed to keep casual readers from understanding the dangerous knowledge contained within. These books are your lifeline to a tradition that stretches back through centuries of Islamic scholarship to the laboratories of ancient Alexandria. but they're also evidence that could get you killed. Owning texts on transmutation and astrology was becoming increasingly dangerous as church authorities grew more suspicious of anything that seemed to challenge orthodox doctrine. You keep your library hidden behind a false wall, and you've memorized key passages so that you could destroy the books if necessary and still continue your work. The secrecy isn't just paranoia, it's essential for survival. Alchemy exists in a grey area between acceptable natural philosophy and forbidden magic, and that line is moving in directions that don't favour your continued breathing. Your typical night in the laboratory follows patterns established through months of careful experimentation. You begin by checking your long-term projects. Solutions that have been circulating in pelicans for weeks, slowly concentrating and purifying. Alchemy isn't about instant results, it's about patient, methodical work that can take months or even years to complete. You're not just mixing chemicals, you're attempting to recreate the same slow processes that nature uses to form metals deep within the earth. Tonight, you're working on what the texts call the Great Work, the creation of the Philosopher's Stone, a substance supposedly capable of transmuting base metals into gold and granting eternal life. You know it sounds impossible, but you've seen enough genuine transformations in your laboratory to believe that even more dramatic changes might be achievable with the right knowledge and technique. You start by checking your mercury preparations. Mercury is the key to everything in alchemy. It's the one metal that's liquid at room temperature, and alchemists believe it contains the essential principles that all metals share. You've been working for months to purify your mercury, removing what you believe are the impurities that prevent it from achieving its full potential. The purification process involves repeated distillation, dissolution in acids, and combination with various salts and minerals. Each step requires precise timing and temperature control. Tonight, you're preparing to combine your purified mercury with sulfur in a process that should, according to Geber's instructions, produce a substance capable of transmuting other metals. The work is dangerous in ways that go far beyond the obvious chemical hazards. Mercury vapor can cause neurological damage. Though you don't understand the mechanism, you just know that prolonged exposure makes alchemists behave strangely and eventually kills them. The acids you're working with can cause horrible burns, and several of your experiments have produced toxic gases that left you gasping and dizzy. But the physical dangers are nothing compared to the spiritual and legal risks you're taking. Every night you spend in this laboratory, you're gambling with your soul and your life. The church is becoming increasingly hostile to anything that smacks of magic or heresy, and alchemy is starting to look suspicious on both counts. You work by the light of carefully shielded candles, listening constantly for footsteps in the corridors above. Discovery would mean interrogation, trial, and almost certainly execution. The Inquisition has efficient methods for dealing with suspected heretics, and they're not particularly interested in distinguishing between legitimate natural philosophy and demonic magic. As you heat your mercury and sulfur mixture, watching the vapors rise and condense in your alembic, you can't help but wonder if you're crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. The transformation you're witnessing, the way substances change their fundamental nature under the influence of heat and chemical combination, seems almost miraculous. Is this divine knowledge, or are you meddling with forces that properly belong to God alone? The mixture in your retort begins to change colour, shifting from silver grey to deep red as the temperature rises. This is the moment of truth. Either your months of preparation have been successful, or you're about to waste expensive materials and possibly poison yourself with toxic fumes. You adjust the airflow to your furnace, maintaining the precise temperature that Geber's text specifies for this crucial stage of the process. Outside, you can hear the monastery bell tolling midnight. Brother Benedict will be making his rounds soon, checking that all the monks are in their cells and properly asleep. You'll need to extinguish your furnace and hide all evidence of your work before he reaches this section of the building. The life of a medieval alchemist is measured in stolen hours and borrowed moments, always working against time and discovery. But tonight feels different. Tonight, you're convinced that you're on the verge of a breakthrough that will justify all the risks you've taken. The substance in your retort is exhibiting properties unlike anything you've created before. If the ancient texts are correct, you might be holding the key to to transformations that will change everything. Of course, you have no idea that your work has already attracted attention from people who are very interested in changing everything about your future, specifically making sure you don't have one. The thing about medieval alchemy that nobody tells you in the mystical texts is how much of your time gets spent on absolutely mundane tasks that have nothing to do with cosmic secrets and everything to do with basic survival. When you're not dodging church authorities or risking chemical poisoning, you're dealing with the practical nightmare of maintaining a secret laboratory in an age when privacy doesn't exist and suspicious behavior travels faster than bad news. Take procurement, for example. You can't just walk into a medieval hardware store and ask for mercury, sulfur, and laboratory glassware. These materials are expensive, controlled, and asking too many questions about where to find them is a great way to attract exactly the kind of attention you're trying to avoid. Mercury comes from cinnabar mines, but good luck explaining to a merchant why a monk needs several pounds of liquid metal for religious purposes. Sulfur is easier to obtain. It has legitimate uses in medicine and warfare, but buying it in the quantities you need for serious alchemical work requires either significant wealth or creative explanations. You've developed a cover story about treating skin conditions and preserving manuscripts, which works until someone asks why you need enough sulfur to treat a small army of very itchy scribes. Glassware is perhaps the most challenging requirement. The sophisticated apparatus needed for advanced alchemy has to be custom-made by skilled craftsmen, and every piece you commission is essentially an advertisement of your illegal activities. You've learned to spread your orders across multiple glassblowers in different cities, paying premium prices for their discretion and hoping that none of them decide to supplement their income by informing the authorities about their unusual commissions. Then there's the problem of waste disposal. Alchemy produces a lot of byproducts, many of them toxic, all of them potentially incriminating. You can't just dump failed experiments into the monastery garden. Apart from the environmental damage, the resulting dead plants and sickened animals would raise questions you're not prepared to answer. Instead, you've developed an elaborate system for neutralizing and disposing of your chemical waste, often traveling miles from the monastery to bury containers of toxic sludge in remote locations. The secrecy extends to every aspect of your double life. You've become an expert at explaining away the stains on your fingers, ink from copying manuscripts, the burns on your hands, accidents while tending the cooking fires, and the lingering chemical odors that sometimes cling to your robes, medicinal preparations for the monastery's sick. Each lie requires careful maintenance, and you live in constant fear that someone will notice inconsistencies in your stories. Your sleep schedule is completely destroyed. Alchemical processes don't respect normal human rhythms. Your experiments run on their own timetables, requiring attention at specific intervals, regardless of whether it's convenient or safe to be wandering around the monastery. You've learned to function on 2 or 3 hours of sleep per night, supplemented by strategic naps during prayer sessions when your exhaustion can be mistaken for deep spiritual contemplation. The physical toll is starting to show. Chronic exposure to mercury vapor has given you a tremor in your hands that you blame on age, though you're barely 30. The acids you work with have left permanent stains and scars on your fingers. Your lungs burn from breathing chemical fumes in poorly ventilated spaces, and you've developed a persistent cough that worries the monastery's physician. But perhaps the worst part is the isolation. Alchemy is inherently solitary work. You can't share your discoveries, can't seek advice when experiments go wrong, can't even complain about the daily frustrations of trying to unlock cosmic secrets while hiding in a cellar. The knowledge you're accumulating is fascinating and potentially revolutionary, but there's nobody you can safely discuss it with. Well, almost nobody. You're not the only person in medieval Europe crazy enough to risk everything for the promise of transmutation. There's a small, scattered community of alchemists working in similar isolation, connected by networks of correspondence and occasional clandestine meetings. These connections are dangerous. Associating with other suspected practitioners multiplies your risk of discovery, but they're also essential for your continued progress. Master Thomas, a physician in the nearby city, shares your interest in chemical medicine. Your correspondence with him is conducted through coded letters that discuss philosophical matters and natural observations, but beneath the careful language you're exchanging practical information about laboratory techniques and experimental results. Thomas has access to materials and equipment that you can't obtain through monastery channels, and his medical practice provides him with cover for chemical activities that would be suspicious coming from a monk. Isabella the Wise Woman operates on the fringes of respectable society, preparing herbal remedies and occasional love potions for clients who pay well for her discretion. Her knowledge of plant-based chemistry complements your work with metals and minerals, and she's proven surprisingly skilled at obtaining rare ingredients through her network of herb gatherers and travelling merchants. The Church already views her with suspicion. Wise women occupy a dangerous middle ground between acceptable healers and accused witches, but her expertise makes the risk of association worthwhile. Then there's Brother Albertus at the monastery in Cologne, a fellow monk whose letters on theological philosophy contain some of the most advanced alchemical thinking you've encountered. Albertus has managed to reconcile alchemy with Christian doctrine in ways that might actually protect him if church authorities investigate his activities. His argument that alchemical transformation mirrors the spiritual transformation of the soul is elegant and potentially persuasive, assuming the interrogators are inclined to listen to theological arguments rather than simply light the pyre. These relationships sustain you through the long nights of solitary experimentation, but they also create new vulnerabilities. Every letter you send could be intercepted and decoded. Every meeting carries the risk of discovery, and if any member of your network is captured and interrogated, the entire group becomes vulnerable to exposure. Medieval torture is extremely effective at extracting information, and even the most loyal colleagues have been known to provide names when their fingernails are being removed with hot pincers. You try not to think about this possibility too much, but it's always there in the back of your mind. The knowledge that your friends might become your executioners if circumstances change. For now, though, these connections provide the intellectual and emotional support you need to continue your work. You share discoveries, debate techniques, and collectively push the boundaries of what's possible in your hidden laboratories. Together, you're advancing human knowledge in ways that won't be fully understood for centuries, assuming any of you live long enough to see your work reach fruition, because while you've been focused on the challenges of conducting secret research and maintaining underground networks, other people have been paying attention to your activities, and these people have significantly more resources, legal authority, and enthusiasm for burning heretics than you have for transmuting metals. Your midnight experiment is interrupted by a sound that every medieval alchemist learns to fear: footsteps in corridors where no one should be walking. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that suggest official business rather than casual wandering. You extinguish your furnace immediately, flooding the laboratory with darkness and filling the air with the acrid smell of snuffed candles and cooling metal. This is the nightmare scenario you've prepared for countless times. The sudden need to hide all evidence of your activities before discovery leads to interrogation, trial, and execution. Your hands move automatically through the concealment routine you've practiced obsessively. Chemical apparatus disappears into hidden compartments. Books vanish behind false walls. The remaining evidence of your night's work gets shoved into containers that will be buried in the monastery garden tomorrow, assuming you survive the next few hours. The footsteps are getting closer, accompanied now by the sound of low voices discussing something in tones too quiet to overhear, but urgent enough to suggest trouble. You crawl through the narrow passage that connects your laboratory to the wine storage, emerging among barrels of monastery ale, with your heart hammering against your ribs and chemical stains on your hands that you pray won't show in candlelight. Brother Benedict appears at the storage room entrance, carrying a lamp and wearing an expression that suggests this isn't a routine inspection. Behind him stands a figure you don't recognize, a thin, pale man in travelling clothes, whose intense eyes seem to catalogue every detail of the room, including the suspicious monk emerging from behind the wine barrels at midnight. "Brother Marcus," Benedict says carefully, "I'd like you to meet Brother Dominic. He's come from Rome with some questions about our monastery's scholarly activities." The way Benedict emphasizes scholarly activities tells you everything you need to know. This isn't a random visit. Someone has been asking questions about your work, and those questions have reached the attention of people who specialize in asking much more pointed questions under much less comfortable circumstances. Brother Dominic studies you with the patient intensity of a cat watching a mouse, taking in your appearance, your location, and probably the faint chemical odors that you never quite manage to wash out of your clothing. When he speaks, his voice is soft and measured in a way that somehow manages to be more intimidating than shouting would have been. Brother Marcus, I understand you have an interest in natural philosophy. Perhaps we could discuss your studies tomorrow after morning prayers. I'm particularly curious about your perspective on the proper boundaries between legitimate scholarship and more questionable pursuits. The phrase questionable pursuits hangs in the air like a threat. You manage to nod and mumble something appropriately humble about being honored by his interest in your simple studies, but inside, your mind is racing through possibilities and calculations. How much do they know? How much can you safely admit? And most importantly, how long do you have before this conversation turns into the kind of interrogation that people don't usually survive? As you follow Benedict and Dominic back toward the main monastery buildings, you catch a glimpse of your reflection in a window and realize that your face probably reveals far more fear than would be appropriate for an innocent monk discussing harmless scholarly pursuits. Medieval inquisitors are experts at reading faces, and the expression you're wearing right now is approximately equivalent to a signed confession. The night that started with such promise, visions of successful transmutation and revolutionary discoveries, has suddenly become a desperate struggle for survival, and this is just the beginning. Brother Dominic hasn't travelled from Rome to ask a few polite questions and then return home satisfied. He's here because someone believes there's heresy in this monastery, and he won't leave until he's found it, documented it, and dealt with it according to church law. Medieval church law regarding heretics is notably lacking in provisions for mercy, second chances, or benefit of the doubt. As you reach your cell and prepare for what might be your last night of freedom, you can't help but reflect on the irony of your situation. You've spent years trying to unlock the secrets of transformation, learning how to change the essential nature of metals through the application of heat, chemicals, and careful technique. But you never figured out how to transform yourself from a suspected heretic into someone who could safely pursue knowledge without risking everything. That particular transmutation might be beyond even the most advanced alchemy. Tomorrow, Brother Dominic will begin asking his questions in earnest. Tomorrow, you'll discover whether your years of careful secrecy have been sufficient to protect you, or whether your passion for forbidden knowledge has finally led you into a trap from which there's no escape. Tonight, for possibly the last time, you're still Brother Marcus the alchemist. Tomorrow, you might just be Brother Marcus the accused heretic, and medieval history suggests that's not a career change with good long-term prospects. Sleep well, if you can. Morning prayers have never felt so much like a funeral service, especially when you're not entirely sure whether it's going to be yours. You kneel in the chapel alongside your fellow monks, trying to focus on the Latin verses, while Brother Dominic's eyes burn into the back of your skull like twin brands. Every cough, every shuffled movement, every whispered amen feels amplified in the stone chamber, and you're convinced that your guilty conscience is broadcasting your sins to everyone within a 10-mile radius. The irony isn't lost on you that you're praying for divine protection while the church's own representative sits 3 rows behind you, probably composing a mental list of questions that will determine whether you spend the next few years copying manuscripts or the next few minutes being tortured for information about your heretical activities. When the service ends, Brother Dominic doesn't waste time with pleasantries. Brother Marcus, shall we continue our discussion about your scholarly pursuits? I've prepared a comfortable space in the scriptorium where we can speak privately. The way he says privately suggests that your comfort isn't his primary concern, and the scriptorium, normally a place of peaceful learning, suddenly sounds like a medieval interrogation chamber, which, let's be honest, it probably is. You follow Dominic through corridors that seem longer and more ominous than usual, past familiar rooms that now feel like places you might never see again. The scriptorium has been rearranged since yesterday, the normal writing desks pushed aside to make room for a single table where Dominic has arranged several items that make your blood run cold. There's a collection of confiscated books, some alchemical apparatus that definitely doesn't belong to the monastery's official collection, and what appears to be a detailed map of the local area, with several locations marked in red ink. "Please sit," Dominic says, gesturing to a chair that faces directly into the morning sunlight streaming through the window. It's a classic interrogation technique. Put the subject where they'll be uncomfortable and partially blinded while the questioner remains in shadow. You're beginning to understand that Brother Dominic's soft-spoken manner conceals a mind trained in the art of extracting information from people who really don't want to provide it. "I've been investigating reports of unusual activities in this region," Dominic begins, settling into his own chair with the casual confidence of someone who holds all the cards. "Strange purchases of laboratory equipment, correspondence between religious institutions and known practitioners of questionable arts, unexplained illnesses among livestock in areas where suspicious individuals have been seen disposing of materials." Each item on his list hits like a physical blow. The glassware you commissioned last year, the letters you've exchanged with Thomas and Isabella, the site where you buried failed experiments that apparently weren't as secret as you thought. Dominic has been building a case against you for months, possibly years, and you're only now discovering how thoroughly your activities have been documented. "Now," Dominic continues, opening a leather-bound journal and dipping a quill in ink, "let's discuss your interest in natural philosophy. What texts have you been studying? What experiments have you conducted? And most importantly, what have you discovered that you believe the Church should know about?" The questions sound reasonable, almost scholarly, but you understand the game being played here. Any admission of alchemical activity can be twisted into evidence of heresy. Any denial can be proven false with the evidence Dominic has already collected, and any attempt to explain the theological justifications for your work will be interpreted as attempts to rationalize forbidden practices. You're trapped, and the worst part is that you walked into this trap willingly, one midnight experiment at a time. The thing about Inquisition interrogations that nobody mentions in the historical texts is how polite they start out. Brother Dominic isn't screaming accusations or threatening immediate torture. He's conducting what feels like a scholarly discussion, asking thoughtful questions about your research interests and nodding attentively when you provide careful, heavily edited answers about your studies in natural philosophy. For the first hour, you almost convince yourself that this might be survivable. Maybe Dominic is genuinely interested in academic discourse. Maybe the evidence he's collected can be explained away as the innocent activities of a curious monk. Maybe you can navigate this conversation without admitting anything that will get you burned at the stake. Then Dominic produces a piece of parchment covered in your handwriting, and your hopes of talking your way out of this situation evaporate faster than mercury in an open flame. "This is interesting," Dominic says, studying the document with the attention of a scholar examining a particularly fascinating text. "It appears to be a detailed description of a process for creating what you call philosophical mercury. The instructions involve repeated distillation, dissolution in acids, and combination with sulfur under specific astrological conditions. Would you care to explain how a simple monk acquired such detailed knowledge of chemical procedures?" The parchment is from your personal notes, the private journal where you recorded experimental results and theoretical observations. It shouldn't exist outside your hidden laboratory, which means either your security measures failed catastrophically or someone has been inside your secret workspace. Neither possibility suggests good things about your immediate future. You try to explain that you were merely copying texts from ancient sources, pursuing theoretical knowledge without practical application, but Dominic has clearly done his homework on alchemical literature, and he's not impressed by your claims of innocent scholarship. "Brother Marcus," he says with the patience of someone who has had this conversation many times before, "the procedures described in your notes are not found in any standard philosophical texts. They represent original research, practical experimentation, and direct observation of chemical processes. This is not the work of someone copying ancient authorities. This is the work of someone conducting active alchemical research." He's right, of course. Your notes contain innovations and observations that go far beyond anything found in traditional sources. You've developed new purification techniques, identified previously unknown chemical reactions, and made genuine advances in understanding how matter behaves under different conditions. In a more enlightened age, this would be recognized as valuable scientific research. In 1203, it's evidence of heretical activity. Furthermore, Dominic continues, producing another document that makes your stomach drop into your boots. "We have correspondence between you and several individuals of questionable reputation. Master Thomas has been questioned about his medical practices and has provided quite detailed information about your collaborative research. Isabella the Wise Woman was arrested last week and proved remarkably forthcoming about her associates once proper pressure was applied. And Brother Albertus is no longer in a position to continue his theological philosophy. The casual way Dominic delivers this information, the matter-of-fact tone that suggests torture and execution, are simply administrative procedures, tells you everything you need to know about how this interrogation is likely to end. Your network of fellow researchers has been systematically identified, captured, and eliminated. You're not just facing individual charges, you're being processed as part of a coordinated crackdown on alchemical activity throughout the region. The Church, Dominic explains, settling back in his chair with the satisfaction of someone delivering a well-prepared lecture, has become increasingly concerned about the spread of practices that blur the line between legitimate natural philosophy and forbidden magic. Alchemy, in particular, presents theological problems that cannot be ignored. And here it comes, the formal justification for why your years of careful research have made you a target for ecclesiastical punishment. You're about to receive a lecture on the theological basis for burning alchemists, delivered by someone who clearly enjoys his work. The theological case against alchemy, as Brother Dominic explains it with academic thoroughness, rests on several fundamental principles that you've apparently been violating with spectacular consistency. First, there's the question of divine authority over creation. God established the natural order of the world, including the distinct properties of different substances. Attempting to change lead into gold isn't just chemistry, it's an assault on the fundamental structure of reality that God put in place. Consider, Dominic says, warming to his subject with the enthusiasm of a professor discussing his favourite topic, the implications of successful transmutation. If base metals can be transformed into gold through human artifice, what does this say about the permanence of God's creation? Are we to believe that the Almighty made mistakes in his assignment of properties to different substances? Or are we to conclude that human knowledge can improve upon divine design? It's a clever argument, and one that you've wrestled with during long nights in your laboratory. The idea that your experiments might be challenging God's authority has always troubled you, even as you've convinced yourself that understanding natural processes is a form of worship. But Dominic frames the issue in terms that make your research sound like cosmic rebellion rather than scientific inquiry. Second, there's the problem of astrology. Most alchemical texts insist that successful transmutation requires careful attention to celestial influences, beginning work when certain planets are in favourable positions, avoiding procedures when malevolent stars are ascendant. This astrological component of alchemy puts it uncomfortably close to divination and fortune-telling, practices that the Church has explicitly condemned as forms of demonic magic. Your notes, Dominic observes, flipping through your confiscated journal, contain numerous references to planetary influences and astrological timing. You describe waiting for the conjunction of Mars and Venus before beginning certain procedures. You avoid working when Saturn is dominant. These are not the practices of someone studying God's creation. These are the practices of someone seeking power through supernatural forces. The accusation stings because it contains just enough truth to be difficult to refute. You have been timing your experiments according to astrological principles, not because you believe in supernatural influences, but because the ancient texts insist that such timing is necessary for successful results. But explaining this distinction to an Inquisition tribunal would require admitting that you've been conducting the very experiments you're accused of, which rather defeats the purpose of maintaining your innocence. Third, and perhaps most damaging, there's the issue of secrecy. Why do alchemists work in hidden laboratories and write their procedures in coded language? What legitimate purpose is served by concealing knowledge that could benefit mankind? The obvious answer from the Church's perspective is that alchemical practices involve something shameful, dangerous, or explicitly forbidden. Honest scholarship, Dominic notes with pointed emphasis, does not require concealment. The monastery's scriptors work openly, copying and preserving texts for the benefit of future generations. The physicians treat their patients in full view of colleagues and students. Even our theological discussions are conducted in forums where ideas can be examined and debated. But alchemy skulks in shadows, whispers in corners, and hides its discoveries from honest scrutiny. You want to explain that the secrecy is protective rather than sinister, that alchemists hide their work because people like Brother Dominic are hunting them down and burning them alive. But pointing this out would essentially be confessing to the charges against you, which seems counterproductive, given that the goal is to avoid being burned alive. The fourth theological problem with alchemy is its association with claims of extending human life, or even achieving immortality. The philosopher's stone isn't just supposed to transmute metals. According to legend, it can also serve as an elixir of life, granting perfect health and unlimited lifespan to those who consume it. From the Church's perspective, this represents a direct challenge to God's sovereignty over life and death. The promise of immortality through human artifice, Dominic explains, is perhaps the most blasphemous aspect of alchemical claims. Death is part of God's plan for humanity, a consequence of the fall, and a pathway to judgment and redemption. To seek immortality through chemical means is to reject God's authority over human destiny, and to pursue the same prideful ambitions that led to Adam's expulsion from Eden. This argument hits particularly hard because you have been researching life extension compounds, convinced that understanding the processes of aging and decay might lead to genuine medical breakthroughs. But framed in theological terms, your research sounds like an attempt to usurp divine prerogatives, which is definitely not the sort of impression you want to make during an Inquisition hearing. Finally, there's the practical concern that alchemical knowledge, even if not explicitly demonic, is dangerous in the wrong hands. The same techniques used to purify metals can be applied to create poisons, explosives, and other weapons. The acids and compounds produced in alchemical laboratories have obvious military applications, and the secrecy surrounding alchemical practices makes it impossible for church authorities to monitor how such knowledge is being used. We have reports, Dominic mentions casually, of alchemical compounds being used to poison political rivals, to destroy fortifications, and to create false documents through chemical alterations of ink and parchment. Whether or not individual alchemists intend such applications, their research contributes to a body of knowledge that threatens the stability of Christian society. It's a comprehensive indictment, built on months of investigation and delivered with the confidence of someone who has made these arguments successfully in previous cases. Brother Dominic isn't just accusing you of individual heresy, he's explaining why alchemy as a whole represents a threat that the Church must eliminate systematically and thoroughly, and you're beginning to understand that this interrogation isn't about determining your guilt or innocence. It's about documenting your crimes for the record and providing you with an opportunity to confess and repent before the inevitable sentence is carried out. Medieval justice moves with surprising efficiency when the outcome has already been determined. The afternoon session of your interrogation takes a distinctly different tone. Brother Dominic has finished explaining the theological case against alchemy and moved on to what he delicately calls practical matters. These practical matters, it turns out, involve detailed questions about your specific activities, your associates, and your sources of funding and materials. Let's discuss your laboratory, Dominic says, consulting a set of notes that suggest he knows far more about your secret workspace than you're comfortable with. We've identified the location of your hidden chamber, catalogued the equipment you've accumulated, and analysed residues from your experimental work. The sophistication of your setup indicates significant investment and considerable expertise. Who provided the funding for this enterprise? The question is a trap. If you claim to have funded everything yourself, you'll need to explain how a simple monk acquired the resources for expensive laboratory equipment. If you admit to outside funding, you'll be implicating other people in your heretical activities. And if you refuse to answer, well, medieval interrogation techniques are quite effective at encouraging reluctant witnesses to become more cooperative. You try to explain that your equipment was acquired gradually over many years, assembled piece by piece through careful saving and occasional trading of of manuscripts, but Dominic has clearly done an inventory of your laboratory, and he's not impressed by claims of modest accumulation. The glassware alone, he notes, referring to another document, represents an investment of several hundred silver pieces. The quality of your furnace construction required skilled masonry work. The rare minerals and prepared chemicals found in your storage containers are not available through normal monastery procurement channels. Someone with significant resources has been supporting your research. He's fishing for information about wealthy patrons who might have funded alchemical research, probably hoping to expand his investigation to include nobles or merchants who dabbled in forbidden arts. But the truth is more mundane and probably more disappointing than he expects. Most of your equipment was acquired through the slow, patient accumulation of a dedicated obsessive, supplemented by carefully planned theft and creative misappropriation of monastery resources. Furthermore, Dominic continues, your correspondence network extends beyond the individuals we've already apprehended. We've identified letters between you and scholars in Paris, Cologne, and possibly Salamanca. What was the nature of these communications? What information were you sharing? And what instructions were you receiving from coordinators of this philosophical conspiracy? The phrase philosophical conspiracy suggests that Dominic sees your informal network of fellow researchers as some kind of organized heretical movement, complete with leadership structure and coordinated activities. In reality, you've been exchanging letters with other isolated scholars who share your interests, but the Church apparently interprets intellectual correspondence as evidence of subversive organization. You explain that your letters discussed theoretical questions and academic observations, emphasizing the scholarly nature of your communications and downplaying any practical applications. But Dominic produces copies of intercepted correspondence that contain unmistakably practical information about laboratory techniques, experimental results, and specific procedural recommendations. This letter, he says, holding up a document in your handwriting, contains detailed instructions for preparing a compound you describe as extremely volatile and useful for breaking resistant materials. Are we to believe this refers to philosophical contemplation rather than the creation of explosive substances? The letter does indeed contain instructions for creating what amounts to an early form of gunpowder, though you discovered the mixture accidentally while attempting to purify sulfur. But explaining that you stumbled upon explosive compounds while pursuing legitimate alchemical research doesn't really improve your situation, since it confirms that you've been conducting exactly the sort of dangerous experimentation that Dominic is investigating. The questioning continues through the afternoon, with Dominic systematically working through every aspect of your alchemical career. He asks about specific experiments, particular techniques, unusual results, and theoretical innovations. Each question demonstrates increasingly detailed knowledge of your activities, and each answer you provide becomes potential evidence in the case against you. But what makes this interrogation particularly disturbing isn't just Dominic's knowledge of your activities, it's his understanding of the theoretical principles behind your work. This isn't some ignorant fanatic ranting about devil worship. Brother Dominic clearly has significant education in natural philosophy, and possibly even practical experience with alchemical procedures. He asks questions that only someone with genuine expertise could formulate. Your method for purifying antimony, Dominic observes, consulting yet another set of notes, involves a technique not described in any of the standard texts. You've developed an innovation that produces remarkably pure results through repeated sublimation at controlled temperatures. How did you discover that the addition of small amounts of tin during the third distillation prevents the formation of the black residue that typically contaminates the final product? The question hits you like a physical blow. The antimony purification method he's describing represents months of careful experimentation, documented only in your most private notes. More importantly, the specific technical details he mentions, the tin additive, the temperature control, the prevention of black residue, these are discoveries that you made through original research and shared with no one. Either Dominic has conducted his own alchemical experiments, or he's had access to your laboratory for far longer than you realized. Neither possibility suggests good things about your situation or your prospects for survival. I see from your expression that you recognize the accuracy of my description, Dominic continues with what might be satisfaction. The Church, Brother Marcus, is not opposed to knowledge itself. We are opposed to knowledge pursued without proper authority, shared without appropriate oversight, and applied without regard for moral consequences. Your innovations in metallurgy and chemistry could have been valuable contributions to human understanding if they had been conducted under Church supervision and dedicated to appropriate purposes. The implication is clear. Your crime isn't discovering new things. It's discovering them independently and outside institutional control. The Church wants to monopolize not just religious authority, but intellectual authority as well, determining who can pursue what knowledge, under what circumstances, for what purposes. Consider Master Thomas, Dominic says, pulling out a thick file of documents that makes your stomach sink even further. His medical practice provided excellent cover for chemical research, and his innovations in pharmaceutical preparation were genuinely impressive. The pain relief compounds he developed using your shared techniques could have revolutionized medical treatment. Instead, his work has been lost because he chose to pursue it in secret collaboration with suspected heretics rather than seeking proper ecclesiastical approval. The casual past tense with which Dominic discusses Thomas tells you everything you need to know about your friend's current status. Thomas isn't just imprisoned or under investigation. He's dead, and his years of medical research have been destroyed along with him. The knowledge that could have helped countless patients has been eliminated because it was developed outside approved channels. And Isabella, Dominic continues, opening another file with bureaucratic efficiency, possessed remarkable expertise in plant-based chemistry. Her techniques for extracting and concentrating active compounds from herbs were far more sophisticated than anything previously documented. Under proper supervision, her methods could have advanced pharmaceutical science by decades. Instead, her knowledge died with her because she chose to associate with practitioners of forbidden arts. Isabella's death hits you even harder than Thomas's, partly because you introduced her to some of the chemical techniques that Dominic is describing, and partly because you know that her gender made her particularly vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. Medieval society has little patience for women who demonstrate unconventional knowledge, especially when that knowledge involves chemical processes that can produce dramatic and seemingly magical effects. Brother Albertus presented a particularly interesting case, Dominic notes, consulting the thickest file of all. His attempts to reconcile alchemical practice with Christian theology were remarkably sophisticated. He argued that understanding the processes of material transformation was a form of spiritual exercise, that mastering the conversion of base metals into gold paralleled the soul's journey from sin to salvation. His theological framework for alchemy was intellectually impressive and almost persuasive. The word almost hangs in the air like a sword waiting to fall. You remember Albertus's letters, filled with passionate arguments about the spiritual dimensions of alchemical practice. He genuinely believed that his research was bringing him closer to God, that each successful experiment revealed something fundamental about divine creative power. Unfortunately, Dominic continues with academic detachment. Theological sophistication cannot disguise practical heresy. Regardless of how elegantly one frames the pursuit of transmutation in spiritual terms, the underlying activity remains an attempt to usurp divine prerogatives through human artifice. Brother Albertus's intellectual gifts made his case more tragic, but they did not make his crimes less serious. The systematic way Dominic discusses your destroyed network suggests that this crackdown has been planned and coordinated for months, possibly years. Your friends weren't arrested randomly or investigated individually. They were targeted as part of a comprehensive campaign to eliminate alchemical activity throughout the region. The scope of this heretical network, Dominic explains, spreading out a large map covered with red marks and connecting lines, extends far beyond what you might realize. We've identified alchemical practitioners in 17 different cities, connected through correspondence networks, shared techniques, and collaborative research projects. The level of organization and coordination suggests a systematic challenge to church authority that required systematic response. Looking at the map, you can see the full extent of the intellectual community you were part of without realizing it. The red marks represent not just individual alchemists, but entire nodes of scientific activity, informal research centers where knowledge was being developed, shared, and advanced outside official channels. The connecting lines show how information flowed between these centers, creating a shadow network of learning that paralleled but existed independently of approved ecclesiastical scholarship. It's beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Beautiful because it represents human curiosity and intelligence operating despite institutional discouragement. Terrifying because every red mark on that map represents people who are now dead, imprisoned, or facing the same choice between betrayal and martyrdom that you're confronting. The question, Dominic says, folding the map with deliberate care, is whether this network represents a completed threat that has been successfully eliminated, or an ongoing danger that requires continued vigilance and expanded investigation. Your cooperation could help us ensure that this particular form of heretical activity has been thoroughly eradicated. The phrase expanded investigation suggests that your interrogation is just the beginning, that Dominic is looking for information that will lead to additional arrests, more trials, and further destruction of the informal scientific community that has been operating across medieval Europe. Your confession wouldn't just save your life, it would be used to destroy other people who share your intellectual interests. By late afternoon, you realize that this isn't really an interrogation in the sense of trying to discover information. Dominic already knows everything important about your research, your associates, and your methods. This is more like a formal deposition, creating an official record of your activities for use in subsequent legal proceedings. But it's also something more sinister, a systematic debriefing designed to extract every useful detail from your years of research before disposing of you. The Church isn't just eliminating heretical practitioners, it's harvesting their knowledge for its own purposes, ensuring that useful discoveries can be incorporated into approved scholarship, while the original researchers are erased from history. Medieval legal proceedings involving heresy charges, you recall, tend to have very predictable outcomes, but the bureaucratic thoroughness of Dominic's investigation suggests that your case is part of a larger project, one that aims to control not just what people believe, but what they're allowed to discover about the natural world. As evening approaches, Dominic finally gets to the point of this elaborate exercise. "Brother Marcus," he says, setting aside his notes and fixing you with a direct stare, "the evidence against you is comprehensive and undeniable. You have conducted alchemical research in violation of church doctrine. You have corresponded with known heretics and practitioners of forbidden arts. You have created dangerous compounds with obvious military applications, and you have done all of this while pretending to be a faithful servant of God. The accusations hang in the air like a death sentence, which they probably are." But Dominic isn't finished. "However," he continues, "the Church is not without mercy for those who demonstrate genuine repentance. If you are willing to confess your crimes, provide complete information about your associates and activities, and submit to appropriate penance, it may be possible to avoid the most severe consequences of your actions. This is the moment you've been dreading. The offer of a deal that might save your life at the cost of your integrity and possibly the lives of other people. Medieval mercy usually comes with significant strings attached, and you suspect that Dominic's version of appropriate penance might involve things like public recantation, forfeiture of all property, permanent imprisonment, or some combination of punishments that would leave you wishing they'd just burned you at the stake and gotten it over with. What exactly, you ask carefully, would such a confession entail? Dominic smiles with what might be satisfaction or might be predatory anticipation. Complete documentation of your research methods, identification of all associates and correspondence, surrender of all materials and equipment, and public testimony about the dangers of alchemical practice. In return, you would be permitted to live out your remaining years in contemplative isolation, reflecting on your errors and serving as an example of the Church's compassion for repentant sinners. Translation: become an informant, betray everyone you've worked with, and spend the rest of your life in a monastery prison cell, occasionally being dragged out to tell other people why they shouldn't pursue the same intellectual interests that have defined your entire adult life. It's not the worst deal you could have been offered, but but it's hardly an attractive alternative to martyrdom. "I'll need time to consider your offer," you tell Dominic, though you both know that time is one thing you don't actually have. Medieval justice doesn't encourage lengthy deliberation, especially in cases where the evidence is already overwhelming and the desired outcome has been predetermined. Of course, Dominic agrees with apparent understanding. "Take the night to reflect on your situation. We'll continue our discussion tomorrow morning, after you've had an opportunity to pray for guidance." As you're escorted back to your cell by two guards who weren't necessary yesterday but apparently are tonight, you can't help but notice that the monastery feels different. Other monks avoid eye contact as you pass. Conversations stop when you approach. Even Brother Benedict, who has known you for years, seems to be treating you like someone who might be contagious with something terminal. Word has spread about your situation, and your fellow monks are already distancing themselves from someone who's become radioactive from an ecclesiastical perspective. Nobody wants to be associated with a suspected heretic when Inquisition investigators are asking questions about associates and collaborators. Your cell, when you finally reach it, has been searched and cleaned out. Your personal possessions are gone, your writing materials confiscated, and your small collection of legitimate books removed for examination. Even your spare robes have been taken, presumably to be tested for chemical residues that might provide additional evidence of your alchemical activities. The bare walls of your cell seem to mock you with their emptiness. For years, this small space was your refuge, the place where you could retreat from the demands of monastic life and plan your nocturnal expeditions to the hidden laboratory, the corner where you kept your private journal, the niche where you stored spare chemicals wrapped in cloth. All of it is gone, leaving behind only stone walls and the bitter realization of how thoroughly your double life has been exposed. But the physical emptiness of your cell is nothing compared to the psychological isolation that has descended on you like a plague. As word of your interrogation spreads through the monastery, you can feel the social fabric of your community tearing apart around you. Monks who greeted you warmly just yesterday now avoid eye contact. Brothers who once sought your advice on copying manuscripts suddenly have urgent business elsewhere when you approach. The transformation is swift and merciless. Medieval communities have a finely tuned survival instinct when it comes to avoiding association with suspected heretics. Nobody wants to be caught up in an Inquisition investigation, and the safest way to avoid suspicion is to demonstrate enthusiastic distance from anyone already under scrutiny. Brother Peter, who had helped you acquire some of your laboratory equipment under the pretext of monastery maintenance, now refuses to acknowledge your presence during evening prayers. Brother Francis, who had occasionally covered for your absences during night offices, suddenly develops an intense interest in his prayer book whenever you enter a room. Even Brother Sebastian, who had shown genuine curiosity about your philosophical studies, now treats you like you're carrying some sort of spiritual contagion. The silence is perhaps the most unnerving aspect of your new status. Conversations that would normally include you continue as if you weren't present. Discussions about monastery business proceed without your input. Even routine interactions, passing in corridors, sharing meals, participating in communal prayers, are conducted with a careful lack of acknowledgement that makes you feel like you're becoming invisible. This social isolation isn't just cruel, it's strategically deliberate. Medieval interrogation techniques rely heavily on psychological pressure, and one of the most effective ways to break a suspect's resistance is to demonstrate that their entire social world has abandoned them. When facing a choice between confession and defiance, it's much easier to choose martyrdom if you believe that your sacrifice will be remembered and honored by your community. But when your community has already written you off as a dangerous embarrassment, the appeal of heroic resistance diminishes considerably. You're left with a bare room, a hard bed, and the growing realization that tomorrow morning you'll need to make a choice between betraying everything you believe in and facing consequences that the medieval legal system reserves for its most serious criminals. But tonight, as you kneel alone in your stripped cell, your mind keeps returning to the memories that Dominic's interrogation has stirred up. You remember the night when you first successfully purified mercury, watching in amazement as the silvery liquid emerged from your apparatus clearer and more perfect than anything you had ever seen. You remember the moment when you realized that the ancient texts were describing real phenomena, that the mysterious transformations described by Geber and Hermes Trismegistus could actually be reproduced with patience and skill. You remember the letters from Thomas, filled with excitement about new medical applications for your shared techniques. His descriptions of patients whose pain had been relieved by compounds you had developed together made all the risks seem worthwhile. Knowledge that could ease human suffering, discoveries that could advance the healing arts. Surely this was work that served God's purposes, regardless of what church authorities thought about the methods involved. You remember Isabella's visits, her quick intelligence and intuitive understanding of chemical processes, making her one of the most valuable collaborators you had ever encountered. She had taught you techniques for extracting plant essences that revolutionized your pharmaceutical work, and in return you had shared mathematical approaches to chemical proportion that elevated her herbal preparations from folk remedies to genuine medicines. You remember Brother Albertus's passionate letters about the spiritual dimensions of alchemical practice, his conviction that understanding material transformation was a path to understanding divine creative power. His theological framework for alchemy had been intellectually satisfying and emotionally compelling, providing a philosophical foundation that justified the risks and validated the research. All of that is gone now. The people are dead, the research is destroyed, and the knowledge has been scattered or suppressed. Years of patient discovery, collaborative investigation, and genuine scientific progress have been eliminated because they threatened institutional authority. The advancement of human understanding has been sacrificed to maintain ecclesiastical control over intellectual activity. The waste is staggering, but what makes it even more heartbreaking is the realization that this destruction didn't have to happen. The Church could have embraced alchemical research, providing institutional support and official oversight that would have accelerated discoveries while ensuring that new knowledge served appropriate purposes. Instead, they chose to treat independent inquiry as inherent threat, eliminating valuable research rather than risk losing control over intellectual development. As you reflect on the ruins of your life's work, you begin to understand that your individual case is part of a much larger historical struggle between curiosity and control, between the human drive to understand the world and institutional demands for intellectual conformity. Your generation of alchemists represents one side of that struggle, but you're beginning to suspect that you're fighting a losing battle against forces that are more powerful, more organized, and more ruthless than you ever imagined. The knowledge you've developed will survive in fragments, techniques preserved in hidden manuscripts, discoveries rediscovered by future generations, innovations that will eventually emerge under different names in more enlightened times. But the price paid for that eventual progress is measured in destroyed lives and silenced voices, in the systematic elimination of everyone who dared to push against accepted boundaries. Neither option offers much prospect for a happy ending, but at least you're beginning to understand the larger context of your situation. You're not just facing individual charges for personal crimes. You're being processed as part of a comprehensive campaign to control human intellectual development, to ensure that future discoveries happen only under institutional supervision and serve officially approved purposes. Medieval history suggests that such campaigns are often successful in the short term, but the human drive to understand the natural world has a way of reasserting itself despite official discouragement. The question is whether any individual researcher is willing to pay the immediate personal cost for potential long-term progress. That's the choice you'll be making tomorrow morning, whether your individual life is worth sacrificing for principles that might not be vindicated for centuries, and whether the advancement of human knowledge justifies the destruction of everything you've worked to build. As you kneel for evening prayers, you find yourself wondering whether the pursuit of knowledge is worth the price that history demands from those who push against accepted boundaries. Your research has advanced human understanding in ways that might not be recognized for centuries, but the immediate cost is measured in destroyed lives and silenced voices. Maybe the Church is right. Maybe some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue. Maybe the price of scientific progress is higher than any individual should be asked to pay. Or maybe the problem isn't with the knowledge itself, but with a world that punishes curiosity and rewards conformity. Either way, you're about to find out what happens when an unstoppable force called human curiosity meets an immovable object called institutional authority. Medieval history suggests that the institution usually wins, but sometimes the ideas survive long enough to outlive the people who tried to suppress them. Sometimes, tonight, as you prepare for what might be your last night of freedom, you can hear the sounds of other prisoners in the monastery's holding cells. Some are praying loudly, others weeping, and a few maintaining the kind of determined silence that suggests they've already made their choices and are prepared to live or die with the consequences. Tomorrow, you'll discover which category you belong to. Tonight, you're still Brother Marcus the alchemist, wrestling with questions that don't have easy answers and facing decisions that will define whatever remains of your life. The irony is that you became an alchemist in search of transformation, the ability to change the fundamental nature of matter through understanding and technique. But the transformation you're facing now has nothing to do with chemistry and everything to do with the choice between survival and integrity. Some transmutations, it turns out, are more difficult than turning lead into gold. Dawn breaks through your cell window like an unwelcome reminder that some decisions can't be postponed forever. You've spent the night wrestling with impossible choices, and the pale morning light illuminates a truth that's both simple and devastating. There is no good way out of this situation. Every path leads to destruction. The only question is whether that destruction will be yours alone, or whether it will extend to other people whose only crime was sharing your intellectual curiosity. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor announces that your time for reflection has ended. Brother Dominic appears at your cell door with the punctuality of someone who has conducted many similar conversations and knows exactly how they need to proceed. Behind him stand two guards whose presence suggests that today's discussion will be significantly less theoretical than yesterday's interrogation. "Good morning, Brother Marcus," Dominic says, with the kind of polite formality that feels more ominous than outright hostility. "I trust you've had adequate time to consider your situation and reflect on the options available to you. Shall we continue our conversation in a more official setting?" The phrase "more official setting" turns out to refer to the monastery's chapter house, which has been transformed overnight into something resembling a medieval courtroom. Additional church officials have arrived during the night, men in travelling robes whose presence suggests that your case has attracted attention from higher ecclesiastical authorities. A table has been arranged with formal seating, documents have been organised in neat piles, and someone has even brought proper ecclesiastical banners to make the proceedings look appropriately official. This isn't going to be a casual conversation about your possible cooperation. This is going to be a formal trial, complete with witnesses, evidence, and predetermined outcomes. The bureaucratic efficiency of the setup suggests that the Church has conducted many similar proceedings and has refined the process to ensure maximum legal legitimacy with minimum uncertainty about results. You take your assigned seat facing the assembled tribunal, trying to maintain some dignity despite the fact that you're wearing the same robes you've worn for 3 days and probably smell like someone who's been living on prison rations and nervous sweat. The officials arranging themselves across from you represent the full weight of medieval ecclesiastical authority, learned men with the power to decide not just your fate, but the fate of ideas themselves. Brother Dominic begins the formal proceedings by reading a comprehensive list of charges that sounds like a catalogue of every intellectual crime the medieval church has learned to recognise. Heretical research into forbidden arts, correspondence with known practitioners of demonic magic, creation of dangerous compounds with potential military applications, violation of monastic vows through secret activities conducted without proper oversight, corruption of orthodox doctrine through attempts to rationalize ungodly practices. Each charge is documented with specific evidence, complete with dates, locations, and corroborating testimony from sources whose identities remain conveniently unspecified. The case against you has been assembled with legal thoroughness that would be impressive if it weren't being used to destroy your life. Medieval bureaucracy, when it functions efficiently, can be more terrifying than medieval barbarism. Brother Marcus, Dominic concludes after finishing his recitation of charges. How do you respond to these accusations? Do you acknowledge the accuracy of the evidence presented against you, and are you prepared to discuss the terms under which the Church might extend mercy to a repentant sinner? The moment of truth has arrived. Everything you've worked for, everything you believe in, everything you've discovered about the natural world, it all comes down to this single moment when you have to choose between survival and integrity, between betraying your principles and accepting martyrdom for ideas that might not be vindicated for centuries. But as you sit facing the tribunal, something unexpected happens. Instead of fear or despair, you feel a strange sense of clarity settling over you like calm water. The choice you're facing isn't really about your individual survival, or even about the specific charges against you. It's about something much larger and more fundamental, whether human curiosity will be allowed to operate independently of institutional control, and whether the advancement of knowledge will be permitted to proceed through individual initiative or restricted to officially approved channels. Honoured members of this tribunal, you begin with surprising steadiness. I acknowledge conducting research the Church considers inappropriate, corresponding with suspected scholars, and making discoveries that challenge accepted understanding. However, I cannot acknowledge these constitute crimes against God. The study of natural processes represents efforts to comprehend divine creativity, not assaults on it. The room falls silent. Medieval trials don't typically feature defendants delivering philosophical lectures about science and religion. Every successful experiment has revealed new complexity in the natural order, you continue. If understanding creation more fully constitutes heresy, then the Church's definition of orthodox belief is unnecessarily limited. Brother Dominic sets down his pen, leaning back with dangerous curiosity. Continue, he says simply. Alchemy investigates principles governing material transformation, you explain. When we heat mercury and observe its conversion from liquid to powder, we're documenting how matter responds to temperature changes. When we dissolve metals in acids and recover them purified, we're learning about chemical composition. These aren't magical practices, they're systematic investigations. Several officials exchange glances, surprised by your technical sophistication. These investigations have practical applications that could benefit Christian society if pursued with institutional support rather than driven underground. The pharmaceutical compounds I've developed could revolutionize medical treatment. The metallurgical techniques could improve tools and construction. More fundamentally, you continue, moving to philosophical principles. Studying material transformation provides insights into God's creative processes. Learning to transmute base metals reveals the techniques divine wisdom used to create the variety of substances we observe. Dominic leans forward. Your reasoning is sophisticated, Brother Marcus, but you haven't addressed our fundamental concern. The issue isn't individual sincerity or technical success. It's whether such knowledge can be safely developed without proper institutional oversight. The secrecy exists, you respond carefully, because the Church treats alchemical research as inherently suspicious rather than developing frameworks for legitimate investigation. If authorities demonstrated willingness to support and oversee natural philosophical research instead of forbidding it, there would be no need for underground networks. What you're suggesting, Dominic observes with dangerous quietness, is that the Church should accommodate research programs it has determined theologically problematic, rather than expecting researchers to accommodate ecclesiastical authority. I'm suggesting that advancing human understanding serves God's purposes, you reply, and the Church's mission would be enhanced by supporting legitimate research into natural philosophy. The verdict comes swiftly. Dominic finds you guilty of heretical research, correspondence with forbidden practitioners, and challenging ecclesiastical authority. The penalties range from imprisonment to execution, depending on your cooperation. However, he adds, the Church offers clemency for complete cooperation, full confession, identification of all associates, surrender of materials, and consultation on future investigations. In return, permanent house arrest in a remote monastery. The choice is stark: martyrdom for principles or survival through betrayal. I cannot betray colleagues whose only crime was pursuing knowledge, you respond steadily. I cannot help destroy research that could benefit humanity, nor become complicit in making independent inquiry impossible for future generations. Dominic seems genuinely surprised. You're choosing certain death over survival. Your refusal won't save anyone. We have sufficient evidence to proceed regardless. Perhaps, you reply, the value of resistance isn't measured by immediate effects, but by demonstrating that some consider independent inquiry worth defending even when futile. Human curiosity is remarkably persistent. Efforts to suppress intellectual development often create pressures that find new outlets. Your prediction about the futility of suppressing scientific research irritates the tribunal. You're telling the Church their campaign is historically doomed. Brother Marcus, Dominic warns finally, you're ensuring this tribunal has no choice but to impose the most severe penalties. Your continued defense of heretical positions leaves us no alternative. I understand the consequences, you tell them with genuine calm, and accept responsibility for my choices. If advancing human knowledge requires individual sacrifice, I'm prepared. If defending intellectual freedom demands martyrdom, I choose martyrdom over collaboration. The formal sentencing follows with bureaucratic efficiency. Brother Dominic reads the charges, recites the evidence, and pronounces the penalty: execution by burning for unrepentant heresy. The sentence will be carried out publicly in the town square. Your property will be confiscated, research materials destroyed, and correspondence used to prosecute other suspected practitioners. Your name will be struck from monastery records and your contributions eliminated from official histories. Within years, it will be as if you never existed, your discoveries forgotten, your example used to discourage future researchers. But as the guards escort you back to your cell, you carry knowledge that history is longer than institutional memory. The alchemical research the Church works to eliminate represents genuine advances in human understanding that will eventually be rediscovered under different circumstances. The techniques you've developed for purifying metals will be reinvented by future chemists. The pharmaceutical compounds created with Master Thomas will be rediscovered by later physicians. The theoretical frameworks you've constructed for understanding material transformation will be rebuilt by scientists who don't know your name. Your individual fate is sealed, but the intellectual tradition you've been part of will continue in forms you can't predict. Human curiosity is more persistent than institutional opposition, and the drive to understand the natural world will find ways to express itself despite official discouragement. That night, in your cell, you write a final letter, not to any person, since correspondence is monitored, but to future researchers who will eventually take up unfinished work. You hide the letter where it might be discovered by someone who would understand its significance. The letter contains your most important discoveries, promising experimental directions and fundamental insights about principles governing material transformation. It's a message cast into the ocean of time, hoping to reach people who can use its contents to advance human understanding beyond where institutional opposition forced you to stop. You also write principles that sustained you through dangerous research and guided final decisions about cooperation versus resistance. Future researchers will face similar choices about intellectual integrity versus survival, and perhaps your example will provide guidance for their deliberations. You don't expect to be remembered individually. Medieval institutions efficiently erase inconvenient people from historical records, but you hope ideas will survive in some form, that discoveries will eventually contribute to human knowledge, even if your name is forgotten, and that your example of choosing intellectual integrity over safety will inspire others facing comparable situations. Medieval history is full of people who chose martyrdom for beliefs, but most died for religious or political convictions rather than intellectual principles. Your case represents something unusual, someone willing to die specifically for the right to pursue independent research despite institutional opposition. Whether this choice will prove historically significant depends on factors beyond your control. on whether future generations will value intellectual freedom enough to remember those who sacrificed for it, and whether human drive to understand the natural world will prove stronger than institutional efforts to control intellectual development. Your execution, when it comes, is conducted with ceremonial efficiency medieval society reserves for significant public events. The town square fills with spectators witnessing the fate of someone who challenged ecclesiastical authority over intellectual activity. Brother Dominic delivers a sermon about dangers of prideful inquiry and importance of submitting human reason to divine authority as interpreted by church institutions. Your final moments provide one last opportunity to address the crowd. You use it to restate conviction that understanding the natural world serves God's purposes and that advancing human knowledge benefits Christian society. You don't recant research or apologize for discoveries, but express hope that future generations will find ways to pursue legitimate intellectual inquiry without choosing between knowledge and survival. The flames consume your body and the manuscripts representing years of patient research, but cannot destroy ideas you've helped develop or the example of intellectual courage under extreme pressure. Your individual story ends with execution, but the larger story of human intellectual development continues beyond institutional control. Medieval Europe moves on without you, but questions you investigated and principles you defended remain relevant for future generations facing their own choices about intellectual freedom, institutional authority, and the price individuals should pay for advancing human understanding. Your name disappears from official records, but ideas survive in fragments that will eventually be assembled by people who don't know their source but recognize their value. The research tradition you represented goes underground temporarily, but emerges when historical conditions become more favorable for independent intellectual inquiry. Human knowledge advances despite institutional opposition, not through dramatic confrontations but through patient accumulation of discoveries made by people who consider understanding the world worth whatever risks are involved. Your story is both uniquely medieval and timelessly relevant because every historical period presents people with choices between intellectual integrity and personal safety, between advancing human knowledge and accommodating institutional power. Specific circumstances change, but fundamental choices remain constant across centuries and cultures. You chose knowledge over safety, principles over survival, and intellectual integrity over personal preservation. Whether that choice was wise depends on values extending beyond individual calculation to include assessments of what human civilization requires from its most curious and courageous members. Medieval history suggests such choices are always difficult and rarely vindicated short-term. But human history suggests they're also necessary for long-term advancement of understanding and eventual development of societies that value intellectual freedom enough to protect rather than punish those who exercise it. Your legacy lies not in any monument. Medieval institutions ensured those never existed, but in the example you provided of someone who considered pursuit of truth more important than preservation of life. That example becomes part of intellectual tradition future researchers will inherit, along with discoveries and principles that survived your execution. The last word belongs not to you or church authorities who destroyed you, but to human capacity for curiosity and inquiry that persists despite all efforts to control or eliminate it. That capacity will eventually produce societies that honor rather than punish intellectual courage, but only because people like you were willing to pay the immediate price for long-term progress. Your story ends, but the story of human intellectual development continues, and that continuation is perhaps the most fitting memorial anyone could ask for. The weeks following your execution see a flurry of activity as Brother Dominic and his team work to consolidate their victory over alchemical research in the region. Your hidden laboratory is thoroughly dismantled, with every piece of equipment catalogued and destroyed. The glass apparatus you spent years collecting is systematically smashed, the fragments buried in consecrated ground to prevent any possibility of reconstruction. Your carefully accumulated library of alchemical texts is burned in a ceremonial bonfire that Brother Dominic describes as cleansing the community of dangerous knowledge. But medieval institutional memory proves shorter than medieval bureaucratic thoroughness. Within months of your execution, Dominic receives new assignments that take him to other regions, where other suspected heretics require investigation. The detailed records of your case are filed away in ecclesiastical archives, becoming part of a vast bureaucratic machine that processes dissent with efficient indifference. The monastery returns to its normal routines with surprising speed. Your cell is reassigned to a new monk who shows no interest in natural philosophy and demonstrates proper enthusiasm for copying religious manuscripts. The wine storage area where you accessed your secret laboratory is reorganized, and the hidden entrance is eventually discovered and sealed during routine maintenance. Within a year, it becomes difficult to find anyone who admits to having known you well or having suspected your nocturnal activities. This institutional forgetting is deliberate and systematic. Medieval authorities understand that the most effective way to discourage future heretical activity is to erase all traces of past examples, making it impossible for potential dissidents to find inspiration or guidance in historical precedents. Your individual story must disappear so that the larger narrative of church authority over intellectual development can remain unchallenged. But human knowledge has a way of surviving even the most determined efforts at suppression. Some of your discoveries persist in forms that would be impossible for church authorities to detect or eliminate. The pharmaceutical techniques you developed with Master Thomas find their way into folk medicine through channels that operate below the level of official attention. Wise women and village healers begin using preparations that contain compounds you identified, though they have no idea of their scientific origin. The metallurgical innovations you refined through years of experimentation gradually influence blacksmithing and jewelry making throughout the region. Craftsmen who never heard your name begin using purification methods that you developed, discovering through trial and error that certain procedures produce superior results without understanding the chemical principles involved. Your research lives on disguised as practical craft knowledge. More importantly, the intellectual network that connected you to researchers across medieval Europe proves more resilient than Brother Dominic anticipated. While your generation of alchemists has been largely eliminated, the ideas you developed together continue to circulate through underground channels that adapt to increased surveillance and persecution. In monasteries across France and Germany, monks who never corresponded with you directly begin conducting experiments based on techniques that reach them through multiple intermediaries. The knowledge spreads like water flowing around obstacles, finding new channels when existing ones are blocked. Each researcher adds innovations and refinements, gradually advancing understanding beyond the point where institutional opposition forced your generation to stop. The theoretical frameworks you helped develop for understanding material transformation prove particularly persistent. Future investigators rediscover your insights about the role of heat, pressure, and chemical combination in changing the properties of substances. They rebuild your models of how metals form in the earth and how artificial processes can accelerate natural development. The fundamental principles survive even when the specific individuals who first articulated them are forgotten. Perhaps most significantly, your example of choosing intellectual integrity over personal survival becomes part of the historical record that shapes how future generations think about the relationship between knowledge and courage. The story of the monk who died rather than betray his research spreads through scholarly communities, often in highly distorted forms that emphasize mythological rather than historical elements. Some versions of your story claim that you successfully created the Philosopher's Stone before your capture, and that your execution was motivated by church jealousy of your achievement. Others suggest that you discovered the secret of immortality, and that your apparent death was actually a carefully staged escape that allowed you to continue your research in hiding. These legendary embellishments miss the point of your actual choices, but they serve an important function by keeping alive the idea that intellectual courage deserves recognition and honor. The most accurate versions of your story preserve the essential elements: a dedicated researcher who chose principle over survival, a systematic institutional campaign against independent inquiry, and the long-term persistence of human curiosity despite official discouragement. These accounts become part of the intellectual tradition that future researchers inherit, providing both inspiration and warning for people who face similar choices about knowledge and authority. Century by century, the specific circumstances of your case fade into historical obscurity, but the larger questions you embodied remain relevant. Every generation produces individuals who must choose between intellectual integrity and personal safety, between advancing human understanding and accommodating institutional power. The particular forms that choice takes change with historical circumstances, but the fundamental dilemma persists across cultures and centuries. Your medieval context, with its ecclesiastical authority, alchemical research, and Inquisition trials, eventually becomes antiquated and historically remote. But the underlying tension between curiosity and control, between individual inquiry and institutional oversight, between the pursuit of knowledge and the maintenance of existing power structures, remains as contemporary as ever. Renaissance scholars studying your archived case files will recognize familiar patterns in their own struggles with religious and political authorities who seek to control intellectual development. Enlightenment philosophers will cite your example when arguing for intellectual freedom and the importance of protecting independent research from institutional interference. Modern scientists facing political pressure to suppress inconvenient discoveries will find inspiration in stories of researchers who chose truth over safety. The specific techniques you developed for investigating material transformation will be rediscovered and refined by successive generations of chemists, metallurgists, and physicians. Your insights about the role of controlled heating in chemical processes will become fundamental principles of laboratory science. Your innovations in purification and preparation will evolve into standard industrial procedures. Your theoretical models of atomic and molecular behavior will contribute to scientific frameworks that revolutionize human understanding of the physical world. But perhaps more importantly, your commitment to the principle that understanding the natural world serves rather than threatens human flourishing will become part of the intellectual foundation upon which modern scientific culture is built. The idea that investigation and discovery constitute forms of worship rather than rebellion, that knowledge deepens rather than diminishes wonder, that understanding creation more fully honors rather than challenges divine wisdom. These convictions will eventually triumph over the institutional suspicion and persecution that characterized your historical moment. The transformation will be gradual and incomplete, with many setbacks and reversals along the way. Future generations will face their own versions of Brother Dominic, their own tribunals and interrogations, their own choices between collaboration and resistance. Some will choose survival over principle, helping authorities suppress the same intellectual developments they once supported. Others will choose martyrdom over betrayal, dying for ideas that may not be vindicated for centuries. But the overall trajectory of human intellectual development will vindicate your fundamental conviction that understanding the world serves human flourishing, and that societies benefit when they encourage, rather than punish, intellectual curiosity. The specific institutional arrangements that characterized medieval Europe will give way to new forms of organization that provide better protection for independent research and more effective support for innovative investigation. Your individual fate, execution for heretical research, will eventually come to seem like a historical anomaly rather than an inevitable consequence of challenging established authority. Future researchers will work in institutions designed to encourage, rather than suppress, intellectual exploration, with legal protections that make it impossible for religious or political authorities to eliminate investigators whose discoveries challenge conventional wisdom. The irony is that many of these future protections will be motivated by historical awareness of cases like yours, recognition that societies which punish intellectual courage ultimately impoverish themselves by discouraging the very activities that drive long-term progress and development. Your death will contribute to the eventual creation of conditions that make such deaths unnecessary. This doesn't mean that your sacrifice was somehow required or inevitable, or that individual suffering is justified by collective progress. It means that human societies learn slowly and imperfectly from their mistakes, and that the people who pay the immediate price for institutional failures sometimes contribute to eventual improvements that benefit later generations. Your story becomes part of a larger historical narrative about the gradual emergence of intellectual freedom from institutional control, the slow development of social arrangements that protect rather than punish curiosity, and the persistent human drive to understand the world despite official discouragement. That narrative includes many individual tragedies and defeats, but its overall direction moves toward greater rather than lesser support for independent inquiry. Medieval Europe, which killed you for your alchemical research, will eventually produce universities that teach chemistry as a legitimate academic discipline. The Church, which condemned your research on material transformation as heresy, will eventually adapt to scientific frameworks that assume the validity of experimental investigation. Your story ends with your execution, but the broader journey towards societies that value intellectual exploration continues through the centuries.